I've always loved hiking. There's something about getting out into the woods, away from everything, that resets my mind. No traffic, no screens, no constant noise. Just the sound of wind moving through the trees and the crunch of dirt under my boots. So when my old roommate and a close friend suggested a weekend hike in Tennessee, I was all in. The plan was simple. Drive out, spend a day hiking into the woods, camp overnight, then head back the next morning. A straightforward, no-stress trip. I wish it had stayed that way. We hit the trail in the early afternoon. The air was warm but not too hot, the kind of weather that made hiking comfortable. The trail was well-worn but empty. No other hikers. That was fine by me. I liked the isolation. For the first couple of hours, everything was normal. We walked at a steady pace, occasionally stopping to check our map or take a sip of water. The woods were alive with the usual sounds: birds, the distant rustling of small animals in the underbrush, the wind shifting through the trees. Then we reached the stream. It wasn't particularly wide, maybe 10 feet across, but the water was moving fast. It looked deep enough to be a hassle to wade through, so we stopped to figure out the best way across. That's when we saw them. On the other side of the stream, about 5 or 6 guys were getting ready to cross. At first, I didn't think much of it, just other hikers. But then I realized something was off. They weren't wearing clothes, just socks and shoes, nothing else. It took my brain a second to process what I was looking at. A bunch of fully grown, naked men, standing in the woods like it was the most normal thing in the world. They weren't talking, just standing there watching the water like they were waiting for something. Something about the scene felt wrong. I mean, I get it. Some people like hiking naked. It's a thing. I've heard about it before, but seeing it in person, in the middle of nowhere with no warning, felt weird. Then one of them looked at us. Not a casual glance, a direct, unblinking stare. Then the others noticed us too. None of them said a word. They just stared. We weren't sure what to do. Felt awkward as hell. The only way forward was to cross the stream, but that meant getting closer to these guys. After a few moments, they started moving. One by one, they waded into the water. The current was strong, but they moved through it slowly, carefully, never breaking eye contact. That's when I noticed something else. They weren't carrying any gear, no backpacks, no water bottles, no supplies at all. Just naked bodies, moving across the stream with a strange, eerie stillness. They reached our side and stepped onto the bank, water streaming down their legs. None of them spoke. They just stood there for a moment, looking at us, then turned and walked into the woods, disappearing into the trees like they had never been there at all. We waited until they were completely gone before we crossed. I kept glancing back, expecting to see them watching from the tree line, but they were gone. Still, the weirdness of the encounter stuck with me. There was something unnatural about it. Not in a supernatural way, but in a human way. Why would a group of grown men be out here without any gear, just wandering the woods completely naked? And why did they act so strange? As we moved deeper into the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Then, a couple of miles later, we found something that made my stomach drop. Pile of clothes, just off the trail, half hidden in the brush. A mess of shirts, pants, underwear, all crumpled together like someone had stripped them off and left them behind. They looked old, dirty, like they had been there for a while. I didn't say anything, but I could tell my friends saw it too. We all felt it, that creeping unease. Something was wrong with this place. By the time we made it to our campsite, the sun was dipping low. The air had cooled, and the forest was starting to take on that dim, shadowed look that made everything feel a little more eerie. We set up our tents, started a small fire, and tried to shake off the weirdness of the day. But that feeling didn't go away. The woods were too quiet. Normally, at night, you hear things: crickets, distant owls, the occasional rustle of some small animal moving through the underbrush. But now there was nothing, just silence, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why I was awake. The fire had burned low, leaving only faint embers glowing in the dark. Then I heard it, a branch snapping, close. I held my breath, listening. Footsteps, slow, careful. Something or someone was moving through our campsite. I didn't move. My heart was hammering in my chest. Then, through the thin fabric of my tent, I saw a shadow, tall, human-shaped, standing just a few feet away. It didn't move, just stood there, watching. I stayed as still as possible, gripping the handle of my knife so tight my fingers hurt. Then, after what felt like forever, the shadow shifted and walked away. We packed up at first light. None of us talked about what had happened, but we all felt it. The need to get out of there. As we hiked back, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following us. We didn't see the naked men again, but just before we reached the parking lot, we passed a sign we hadn't noticed on the way in. A small, wooden sign nailed to a tree, its paint faded with age. It had only one word on it. We never went back. I was heading east on I-15, just outside of Las Vegas, pushing through the quietest hours of the night. The clock on my dash read 3:02 a.m. The desert stretched out in every direction, dark and empty, with nothing but low hills and scattered shrubs breaking up the land. A full moon hung in the sky, casting just enough light to see the edges of the road without my high beams. The radio had given up miles ago, only catching bits and pieces of static, so I was driving in silence, listening to the hum of my tires on the asphalt and the steady rumble of my engine. I had been following 3 black SUVs for the past hour. They weren't speeding or doing anything erratic, just cruising along at a steady pace, a few car lengths apart, like they were moving together. What caught my eye at first were their plates. Nevada tags, but not normal ones. Just single-digit numbers in sequence, 1, 2, 3. That wasn't something you saw every day. I'm not one to get nosy about other drivers on the road. People drive all sorts of weird cars at night, and I've learned not to overthink it. But something about these SUVs bugged me. They looked identical, blacked-out windows, no visible markings, nothing to say if they were government, private security, or something else entirely. And they weren't passing or slowing down, just keeping their steady pace like they were in no hurry. I kept my distance, staying back but not far enough to lose sight of them. Around 3:20, without any warning, all 3 SUVs flicked their turn signals on at the exact same time. I didn't see a sign for an exit. There were no streetlights, no markers, not even a worn path in the dirt, just open desert. But they turned anyway, right off the highway, onto what looked like nothing more than loose gravel and sand. And then, as soon as they were off the road, their lights shut off completely. 1 second they were there, and the next just black shapes in the desert, swallowed by the night. I felt my stomach tighten. There was nothing out there. No buildings, no power lines, no sign of a ranch or a business. Just dirt and silence. And yet, those SUVs had turned like they knew exactly where they were going. I kept driving. I told myself I didn't care what they were doing. The desert was full of weird stuff. Military installations, private airstrips, even secretive rich guys who bought up land to do God knows what in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't my problem. I was just a trucker hauling freight, trying to get to my next stop without trouble. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen something I wasn't supposed to. I checked my mirrors every few seconds, half expecting to see headlights appear behind me again. Nothing, just darkness. The further I got from that turnoff, the more the back of my neck itched. About 15 minutes later, I spotted a rest stop sign. I wasn't tired, but I wanted to pull over for a minute, stretch my legs, maybe splash some cold water on my face. The turnoff was a half-mile ahead. I flipped my signal on and eased off the highway. The rest stop was empty. A couple of vending machines sat near the entrance, buzzing under yellowed fluorescent lights. There was a single sedan parked near the bathrooms, but I didn't see anyone around. I climbed down from my cab, stretching my arms and rolling my shoulders. The air was still warm, even this late at night. I leaned against my truck and looked out over the highway, half expecting to see those SUVs again in the distance. But the road was empty. I let out a breath and rubbed my eyes. Maybe I was making too much of it. Maybe it was nothing. I decided to grab a drink from the vending machine. I walked over, dug a couple of quarters out of my pocket, and pressed the button for a bottle of water. The machine whirred, the bottle dropped, and I bent down to grab it. And that's when I noticed the footprints. They weren't mine. A few feet away, leading from the edge of the rest stop toward the vending machines, were fresh boot prints in the dust, the kind left by thick-soled military or tactical boots. I stood up slowly and looked around. The rest stop was dead silent. No wind.
No rustling bushes.
Nothing. The footprints were deep, like whoever made them had been walking with purpose. But they stopped near the vending machine, like someone had stood there, watching. I felt a tightness in my chest. I glanced back at my truck, suddenly aware of how exposed I was standing out in the open. I turned quickly and walked back, climbing into the cab and locking the door behind me. I sat there for a moment, gripping the wheel, listening to my own breathing. Then I checked my mirrors again. Nothing. I reached down, put the truck in gear, and pulled out of the rest stop, getting back onto the highway as fast as I could. For the next hour, I kept checking my mirrors, watching the road behind me. But I never saw those SUVs again. By the time the sun started creeping up over the horizon, the whole thing felt like a bad dream. But when I stopped for fuel later that morning, I got out and checked the dust on my truck. There were more footprints, right by my driver's side door. That was the last time I ever stopped along that stretch of highway at night. I spent a few summers working as a camp counselor at a sleepaway camp tucked deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town. The kind of camp that had been around for decades, where the cabins were old, the trails were worn, and every counselor had a story about something weird that had happened over the years. It was the kind of place where the darkness felt heavier at night, where the trees swallowed the last bits of daylight and left everything feeling just a little too quiet. We always told ghost stories around the campfire. It was a tradition. The younger kids got the fun, silly ones, but the older campers wanted something scarier. Something that would stick with them when they lay in their bunks at night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the forest outside. I had my own go-to story, a tale about a ghost that killed people unless they gave him 2 of their teeth and 2 names of other people to take instead. It was the perfect mix of creepy and ridiculous, something that would make the campers uneasy but still let them laugh it off at the end. But the real trick, the thing that made it unforgettable, was what I did after. See, when I was a kid, 2 of my adult teeth never came in. I had gaps where they should have been, and for years I wore a retainer with 2 fake teeth to cover them. It was just one of those weird genetic things, nothing special, but it made for a perfect scare. At the end of the story, right before sending the kids off to bed, I'd quietly pop the retainer out and give them a big, wide grin, showing the empty spaces in my mouth. That moment, the realization in their eyes, the way the fear flickered into something real, was the best part. It was all harmless fun, until one summer, when something happened that I still can't explain. It was late July, the middle of the season. By then, the campers and counselors had settled into the rhythm of things. The newness had worn off, and we all felt comfortable, like we belonged there. The days were long and hot, filled with swimming, hiking, and endless games. The nights were cool, heavy with the scent of pine and campfire smoke. It was easy to forget the outside world existed. That night, my co-counselor and I had taken our group of campers down to the fire pit by the lake for stories. It was one of the last nights of the session, and we wanted to make it count. The fire crackled, reflecting off the water, and the kids huddled close together, wrapped in blankets and sweatshirts. The air buzzed with nervous energy, that perfect mix of excitement and unease that came with a good scary story. I told my usual one, drawing it out, letting the suspense build, watching their faces in the firelight. They hung on every word, eyes wide, breaths held. When I got to the end, when I told them about the ghost's demand for 2 teeth, I reached up and popped out my retainer. The reaction was immediate: gasps, shouts, a few kids scrambling back in pure, unfiltered terror. Perfect. We laughed it off, calmed them down, and sent them back to their cabins, still buzzing from the scare. My co-counselor and I stayed behind for a bit, letting the fire die down, enjoying the quiet. Eventually, we headed back to our own cabin, exhausted but satisfied. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. It wasn't unusual. Camp was full of noises, the wind through the trees, the occasional rustle of an animal moving in the brush. But this was different. I lay still, listening. The cabin was dark, the only light coming from the moon through the windows. My co-counselor was asleep in his bunk across the room, breathing slow and even. Everything was quiet. Then I heard it, a soft rustling just outside the cabin. Not the wind, not an animal, something deliberate. I sat up slowly, my heart already pounding. The cabin door was closed, but the windows were open, letting in the cool night air. I strained my ears, trying to pick out the sound again. There it was, closer this time, a shuffling, almost hesitant, moving along the wall outside. I reached for my flashlight, gripping it tight. My mind raced through possibilities. One of the kids sneaking out? A prank from another counselor? I swung my legs over the side of the bunk, my feet hitting the wooden floor. The boards creaked softly under my weight. The sound outside stopped. I held my breath. For a long moment, there was nothing. Just the wind, the distant sound of the lake lapping against the shore. Then, slow and deliberate, something pressed against the window screen. Not hard, just enough to make it bulge inward slightly, like someone testing it. I flicked on the flashlight and aimed it at the window. Nothing. The screen was still, the woods beyond empty. My pulse hammered in my ears. I waited, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the dark. A minute passed, then another. Finally, I let out a breath. Maybe it had been my imagination. Maybe I dreamed the whole thing. I turned off the light and lay back down, my body tense, my mind unwilling to relax. I stayed awake for a long time, listening, but the sound didn't come back. Morning came, bright and normal, the events of the night already fading into that strange, uncertain space between dream and memory. But when I stepped outside, stretching in the morning sun, I saw them. 2 small, white shapes, sitting just outside the cabin door. Teeth. I stared at them, my stomach dropping. They looked real, smooth, slightly yellowed, like they had been there for a long time. I bent down, hesitating before picking them up. They were cold. Too cold for something that had been outside all night. My mind struggled for an explanation. A prank? Some kind of coincidence? But who would do this? I looked around. The woods were the same as always, quiet and still. Nothing out of place. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I took the teeth and buried them near the fire pit, deep in the dirt. Not sure why, but feeling like I had to. I didn't mention it to anyone. What would I even say? The rest of the summer passed without incident. But I stopped telling that story, and I never, ever took out my retainer at camp again. I had always been drawn to the quiet of the mountains. Hiking alone gave me a kind of peace I couldn't find anywhere else. No noise, no distractions. Just the sound of my boots on the dirt, the wind in the trees, and the occasional rustle of an animal moving through the underbrush. This trip was supposed to be no different. A 3-day solo hike through a stretch of remote wilderness, a route I had mapped out weeks in advance. It wasn't a well-known trail, and that was the appeal. No crowded campsites, no people. Just me and the land. I parked my truck at the trailhead early in the morning, my pack loaded with everything I'd need: tent, food, water, a map, a compass. The sky was a dull gray, the air cool but not cold. Perfect hiking weather. The first few hours passed easily. The trail climbed steadily, winding through thick pine forests, crossing over small creeks and rocky slopes. The farther I went, the quieter everything became. By midday, I had reached a high ridge with a view that stretched for miles. Rolling hills, dense woods, the peaks of distant mountains. I ate a quick lunch, checked my map, and kept moving. The plan was simple: follow the ridge for a while, then descend into the valley where I'd set up camp for the night. From there, I'd hike deeper into the forest, loop around the base of the mountains, and eventually make my way back. Should have been easy, but sometime in the afternoon, I realized something was wrong. The trail had started to fade. At first, it was subtle, the dirt path narrowing, the grass creeping in. Then it became worse. Fallen branches blocked the way. The ground became uneven, rocks and roots jutting up where they shouldn't have been. I checked my map again, frowning. The trail wasn't supposed to be like this. I pushed on, assuming it was just an overgrown section. Maybe fewer people had hiked this way recently, but the farther I went, the worse it got. Then, all at once, the trail was gone. I stopped, looking around. Nothing but thick trees, endless underbrush. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the forest. I had been following a clear path just minutes ago. There was no reason for it to just disappear. I took a breath, trying to stay calm. I wasn't lost. Not yet. I had my compass, my map. I could backtrack if I needed to. I turned around. The trail behind me was gone, too. That didn't make sense. I had just come from there. But now it was as if the forest had swallowed it up.
No footprints.
No broken branches. No sign that anyone had passed through. A knot formed in my stomach. I pulled out my compass, the needle spinning slightly before settling. I checked the map again, tracing my route. I had been heading west. If I kept moving in that direction, I'd eventually cross a stream marked on the map. I started walking. The forest grew denser, the trees pressing in closer. The ground was rough, sloping downward, forcing me to pick my steps carefully. The silence felt heavier now, as if the woods were listening. Minutes passed, then an hour.
No estream.
No trail, no sign of anything. I stopped, wiping sweat from my forehead. I had been hiking for hours. I should have reached the stream by now. I checked my compass again. The needle was pointing the wrong way. My breath caught in my throat. That wasn't possible. I tapped the compass, shook it slightly. The needle wobbled, then settled, still pointing in the wrong direction. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. Something was wrong. I had to get out of here. I turned sharply, deciding to head back the way I had come, even if I couldn't see the trail. I'd retrace my steps, find something familiar. But as I moved, nothing looked right. The trees all looked the same. The ground was uneven, sloping in ways that didn't match what I remembered. It felt like I was walking in circles, but I didn't stop. Then I heard it, a sound, a branch snapping. I froze. It had come from behind me. I turned slowly, scanning the trees. Nothing. The forest was silent again. I stayed still, heart pounding, listening. Another sound, a footstep, not mine. My skin crawled. I wasn't alone. I didn't move, didn't breathe. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, deep in the trees, I saw something. A shape, far away, barely visible through the branches. A figure, motionless, watching. A chill ran through me. I turned and started walking. Faster this time, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. I didn't care where I was going anymore. I just needed to get away. The forest blurred around me as I moved. I stumbled, catching myself against a tree. My legs ached, my throat dry, but I kept going. Minutes passed, an hour. Then I saw something ahead, a structure, a cabin. I hesitated. It was old, weathered. No smoke from a chimney.
No lights.
But it was shelter. I stepped onto the porch, the wood creaking under my weight. The door was slightly open. Pushed it wider, peering inside. Empty. Dust covered everything. A broken chair, a rusted stove, shelves lined with old, empty cans. And something else. Footprints. Not mine. Fresh. My chest tightened. Someone had been here. Recently. I backed away, stepping off the porch. The woods were silent. Then, in the distance, I saw movement. The figure. Closer now. Still watching. I turned and ran. I didn't stop. Not when my lungs burned. Not when my legs screamed for rest. I just ran. Somehow, I found my way back to the real trail. I didn't question it. I just ran. By the time I reached my truck, it was almost dark. I threw my pack into the back, climbed in, and locked the doors. I sat there, breathing hard, staring into the trees. Nothing moved, but I knew I had been followed, and I would never know why. I always liked the woods. I grew up hiking, camping, and hunting with my dad, so being out there never felt unnatural to me. I knew how to read a map, start a fire, filter water, basic survival stuff. But no amount of experience prepares you for the feeling of true fear. The kind that creeps in slow, the kind that makes your stomach drop, makes you second-guess things you were once so sure of. This story takes place a few years ago when I decided to go on a solo camping trip in the middle of nowhere. I was looking for a challenge, something that would push me a little. I'd always wanted to do a deep woods trip where I wouldn't see another person for miles. Just me, my gear, and the wilderness. I found a spot that looked perfect, deep in a national forest, far off the main trails. It was an area with no designated campsites, meaning I had to rely on my own skills to find a good place to set up. I parked my truck at a small, nearly abandoned trailhead and started hiking in with my pack. It was about a 10-mile trek to where I planned to camp, a small clearing near a stream. The hike was rough in some places, thick with underbrush, and there was no trail to follow, but I liked it that way. That was the point, complete isolation. I made it to the spot by late afternoon. It was perfect, quiet, surrounded by thick trees on all sides except for the small clearing where the stream cut through. The water was clear and cold, perfect for drinking. I set up my tent, gathered some wood, and started a fire. Felt good being out there, away from everything. Just the sound of the wind in the trees and the occasional chirp of birds settling in for the night. The first night was uneventful. I ate some of the food I packed, listened to the sounds of the forest, and eventually fell asleep. But the next day is when things started to feel off. It was early morning, and I had just finished boiling some water for coffee when I noticed something strange. A single boot print in the mud near the stream. It wasn't mine. The tread was different, the size a little smaller than my own. My first thought was that maybe I had stepped there the night before and just didn't notice, but I checked my own boots, and the pattern didn't match. That made me pause. I was 10 miles from the nearest road, off any marked trails. No one else should have been out here. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was old. Maybe someone had hiked through here weeks ago, and the print had just held in the damp earth. Still, I found myself looking over my shoulder more often than I wanted to admit. I spent the rest of the day fishing in the stream, cooking, and exploring the area a bit, but that feeling never really left. That nagging thought in the back of my mind that I wasn't alone. That night, I woke up to a sound outside my tent. It wasn't loud, just the soft crunch of leaves, like something moving carefully. My first thought was a deer, maybe a raccoon, but then I heard it again. Slow, deliberate. I stayed still, listening. My tent was zipped up, and my fire had died down to just glowing embers. I reached for my knife, my heart pounding now. Whatever it wasn't moving like an animal. Animals don't move like that. They skitter, they dart around. This was different. It sounded like footsteps. I held my breath and waited. Minutes passed. Silence. Eventually, I convinced myself I was being paranoid. Maybe a branch had fallen. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I told myself that over and over until I finally fell asleep again. The next morning, I stepped outside and immediately saw it. A set of footprints leading up to my campsite. And not just one or two, several. They circled around my tent, stopping near the fire, near my gear, and then they just disappeared. There was no clear path leading away. It was like whoever had been there had just stopped and vanished. My stomach twisted. I looked around, scanning the trees, the underbrush, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. Just the wind, just the trees. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I thought about packing up and leaving right then. But I had planned for a full week out here. I told myself that maybe, just maybe, there was some logical explanation. Maybe I had been walking in circles last night and didn't realize it. Maybe I had made the tracks myself earlier in the day and just didn't notice. Deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The day passed slowly. I spent most of it feeling uneasy, constantly looking over my shoulder. I carried my knife with me everywhere, my hand gripping it so tight my fingers ached. I didn't venture far from camp. The thought of getting lost out there with someone, or something, lurking nearby kept me on edge. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat up in my tent, listening. Sometime around midnight, I heard it again. Closer this time. The sound of leaves shifting, twigs snapping. I felt my breath catch in my throat. Then silence. I sat there, gripping my knife, waiting. I don't know how long I sat like that, but eventually, exhaustion took over, and I must have drifted off. I woke up to the sun rising and a horrible feeling in my gut. I unzipped my tent and stepped outside. All of my gear was gone. My pack, my food, even my boots, gone. My fire pit had been disturbed, ashes scattered. The footprints were back, circling my tent again, deeper this time, like whoever had made them had been standing there for a long time, watching. And then I saw it. A single word, carved into the side of a tree near my tent. Leave. I didn't hesitate. I didn't pack up. I didn't try to find my gear. I just ran. I ran barefoot through the forest, my heart pounding, my mind racing. Every snapped twig behind me made my skin crawl. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually, I saw something through the trees. My truck. Somehow, I had found my way back to the trailhead. I practically collapsed against the door, fumbling for my keys, my hands shaking so bad I could barely get the door unlocked. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. To this day, I have no idea who or what was out there with me. I don't know how they found me, how they moved so silently, how they vanished without a trace. I never went back, never reported it, never told anyone until now, but I still think about it. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I swear I can still hear those slow, deliberate footsteps in the leaves. I had been driving long enough to know when something didn't feel right. I was running a long-haul trip from Illinois down to Arizona, hauling a load of construction materials, mostly rebar and steel beams, heavy but secure. It was a trip I'd done before, mostly interstate, no major mountain passes or tricky back roads. Just a lot of straight, open highway and long stretches of nothing in between. It was late September, the weather still decent but starting to cool off, especially at night. I had planned to make it down to a truck stop outside Oklahoma City before shutting down for a few hours, but I was running ahead of schedule. The road had been clear, and traffic was light, so I figured I'd push a little farther before stopping. I had been on the road for close to 11 hours already, only stopping for fuel once. I wasn't exhausted yet, but I could feel the weight of the drive settling in. My back ached, my legs felt stiff, and my eyes burned from staring at the road for too long. The sun had set about an hour ago, and the stretch of I-40 I was on was quiet, just the occasional set of headlights in the distance, most of them other truckers running night shifts like me. The sky was clear, the stars bright, but out here, that only made the emptiness feel bigger. I kept the cab cool to stay alert. The low rumble of the engine, the only sound besides the tires humming against the asphalt. Then I saw something up ahead. At first, it was just a glow, taillights in the distance, dim and barely moving. As I got closer, I could make out the shape of a vehicle on the side of the road. A pickup, dark-colored, pulled onto the shoulder at a slight angle. Nothing unusual about that. People pull over all the time. Maybe a breakdown, maybe a flat tire. I slowed slightly as I passed, just enough to check if there was someone outside needing help. There was no one, just the truck sitting there, idling, taillights glowing red in the dark. The driver's side door was open. I kept moving. Something about it didn't sit right. I kept checking my mirrors, expecting to see someone step out of the darkness, maybe waving for help, maybe just standing there watching. But there was nothing. After a few more miles, I let it go. It wasn't my problem. If they needed help, they could call for it. I had learned a long time ago not to get involved with roadside situations unless it was a real emergency. But then, about 20 minutes later, I saw another truck. Same make, same model, same dark color, same open driver's side door. This one was farther off the road, barely visible in the darkness. No hazards on, no signs of movement, just sitting there like the first one. I felt my grip tighten on the wheel. Something wasn't right. I kept my speed steady, forcing myself not to check my mirrors as I passed. My brain was trying to come up with a reasonable explanation, but nothing made sense. Two identical trucks, both abandoned in the middle of nowhere. I exhaled slowly, pushing the tension out of my shoulders. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just a weird coincidence. Then I saw a third one. This time it was parked in the median, facing the wrong way. And this time there was someone inside. I only caught a glimpse as I passed, but it was enough. A figure sitting in the driver's seat, barely illuminated by my headlights. Not moving, not looking at me, just sitting there still as a statue. I didn't slow down. I kept driving, my heart thudding in my chest. My breathing felt tight, my hands sweating against the wheel. I had seen some weird things out on the road, but nothing like this. My mind started running through the possibilities. Maybe it was some kind of police sting, though that didn't make sense. Maybe it was a setup, a bait trap for someone dumb enough to stop. Or maybe I shook my head. Didn't matter. I wasn't stopping. The miles passed, the road stretching ahead, dark and endless. I tried to focus, tried to let it go, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Then I saw the headlights. In my mirrors, far behind me, just two pinpricks of light at first. But they were moving fast. Too fast. I kept my speed steady, watching as they gained on me. My stomach clenched as they got close enough for me to see. Pickup truck. Dark-colored. I swallowed hard, keeping my hands firm on the wheel. My mind was racing now, running through my options. If they tried to run me off the road, I was heavy enough that they wouldn't win that fight. But if they had guns, I forced the thought down. Stay calm. Stay smart. The truck pulled into the left lane, speeding up to match my pace. I didn't look over. Didn't give them any reason to think I was rattled. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they cut their lights, vanished into the dark. My pulse pounded in my ears. I could still feel them there, somewhere, running beside me in the blackness. I kept going. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Nothing. Then ahead of me I saw it. Another pickup, parked across both lanes. I hit the brakes, my tires screaming against the pavement, my trailer groaning from the sudden force. I felt my rig shudder, but I kept control, easing onto the shoulder as I came to a full stop. My lights washed over the truck blocking the road. It was empty. The driver's door was open, and behind me, I heard the sound of tires on gravel. I didn't hesitate. I threw the truck into reverse, slamming the pedal down. My trailer swung slightly as I backed up, my heart racing. Then, just before I hit the ditch, I cut the wheel hard and gunned it. The truck roared forward, my trailer fishtailing slightly as I tore back onto the highway. In my mirrors, I saw movement. Figures spilling out from the darkness, scrambling toward the abandoned truck. I didn't stop to see who they were. I just kept driving. I made it to the next town in record time, pulling into a well-lit gas station, my hands still shaking as I shut off the engine. I sat there for a long time trying to process what had just happened. No cops, no reports, nothing on the news, just another quiet night in the middle of nowhere. But I knew better. I never took that route again. Camping had always been my thing. I wasn't one of those people who needed a fancy RV or a designated campsite with bathrooms and picnic tables. I liked real camping, the kind where you pack light, hike into the woods, and set up camp miles away from the nearest road. It was peaceful. No people, no traffic, no noise except for the wind in the trees and the occasional rustling of animals in the brush. That's what I was looking for when I decided to take a solo trip into the mountains. I had done it before plenty of times. I wasn't reckless. I had the right gear, a map, a compass, and enough food to last me several days. I knew how to handle myself in the wilderness, but nothing prepares you for when things go wrong. I had planned for a 3-day trip. I left my truck at a small pull-off near an old Forest Service road and started hiking in the late afternoon. The trail wasn't marked, but I had studied the terrain beforehand and knew the general direction I needed to go. My destination was a small lake, about 10 miles in, where I planned to set up camp. The hike was tough in some spots. The trail was barely visible in places, overgrown with weeds and low-hanging branches. The air was humid, and sweat dripped down my back as I climbed over fallen logs and picked my way through thick underbrush. I didn't see a single person the whole way in. That was exactly what I wanted. By the time I reached the lake, the sun was dipping low. The water was still, surrounded by dense trees on all sides. It was a perfect spot. I set my pack down, stretched out my aching legs, and got to work setting up my tent. I built a small fire, cooked a quick meal, and sat by the water, listening to the distant sounds of birds settling in for the night. I felt good, but that was the last time I would feel that way. I woke up suddenly, heart pounding. For a second, I wasn't sure why. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting faint light against the inside of my tent. The air was still, heavy with the scent of damp earth and pine needles. Then I heard it, a soft rustling, somewhere close. My first thought was an animal, a deer maybe, but something about the sound made my skin prickle. It wasn't random movement, it was slow, deliberate. I held my breath, listening. The sound moved around my campsite, careful, like someone or something was trying not to be heard. I felt my chest tighten. My knife was in my pack, just outside the tent. My heart thumped painfully as I reached out slowly, trying to unzip the tent as quietly as possible. Then silence. I waited, ears straining, but the noise never came back. After what felt like forever, I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe a raccoon sniffing around my camp. Maybe a trick of the wind. I didn't sleep much after that. Morning came, and everything seemed normal again. The uneasy feeling from the night before faded in the daylight. I shook it off, made coffee, and spent the day fishing and exploring the area around the lake. But something felt off. The woods were too quiet. Normally, you hear birds, the occasional crack of branches, the chatter of squirrels. But it was like everything was holding its breath. Still, I ignored it. I told myself I was overthinking. That evening, I built a bigger fire. Something about the warmth, the light, it made me feel safer. I stayed up late, feeding the flames, watching the darkness beyond the fire's glow. I went to bed later than usual, hoping exhaustion would help me sleep through the night. Didn't. I woke up to the same sound, the same slow, careful rustling. But this time it was closer. My pulse hammered in my ears as I lay there, my body rigid. Then a snap, a twig, right outside my tent. Every hair on my body stood on end. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to move. My hand found the zipper of the tent. I tugged it slowly, inching it open, my breath shallow. The fire had died down to faint embers, barely lighting the campsite. I couldn't see anything, just shadows, trees, the dark shape of my pack resting against a fallen log. Then I saw it, a footprint, not mine, fresh in the dirt right near my tent. A boot print. My stomach turned to ice. I scanned the trees, my heart hammering, but there was nothing. No movement, no sound. But I knew then I wasn't alone out there. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The first light, I packed my gear as fast as I could. I wanted to be gone, back to my truck, back to civilization. I kept my knife in my hand the entire time, my eyes darting to the trees, the bushes, scanning for any sign of movement. I hiked fast, too fast. My legs burned, my lungs ached, but I didn't stop. I just needed to get out. But then, about 3 miles from my campsite, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. A tree. Its bark was stripped in places, long gouges running down the trunk. And carved into the wood, deep and rough, were 3 words. Leave now. My blood ran cold. Someone had followed me, watched me, stood outside my tent at night. And now they wanted me gone. I didn't hesitate. I ran. Branches whipped against my arms. Thorns scratched my legs. But I didn't care. I didn't stop until I saw my truck, parked right where I left it. But something was wrong. The driver's side door was open. My stomach twisted as I stepped closer. The inside was a mess. My glove compartment open, papers strewn across the seats. My backpack, which I had left in the passenger seat, was unzipped, my things pulled out. Whoever had been watching me had been here too. I jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine. My tires spun in the dirt as I peeled out, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the wheel. I didn't stop until I hit the main highway. I never reported it. What would I say? That I heard something? That I found a footprint? That someone went through my truck? There was no proof, no cameras, no witnesses, just me. But I know what I saw, and I know I wasn't alone in those woods. I haven't been camping alone since. I was running a long haul from Montana down to Texas, a good-paying load of steel beams headed for a construction site outside of Dallas. The trip was mostly open highway, cutting through Wyoming, Colorado, and into New Mexico before hitting the long stretch of Texas roads. I had done this route before, knew most of the truck stops along the way, knew which places had the best fuel prices, which rest areas were decent, and which ones to avoid. It was a straight run, nothing complicated. The truck was handling well, my trailer was balanced, and the weight was sitting right on the axles. My only concern was making good time so I could get ahead of a storm system I had been hearing about on the radio. Big rain coming out of the northwest, moving fast, threatening to dump water all the way down into New Mexico. I didn't want to be stuck hauling heavy steel on wet roads, so I planned to push through as far as I could before stopping for the night. I had left early that morning, fueled up outside of Billings, and made it past Cheyenne before sunset. The air was cooling down, the roads mostly empty except for a few other truckers running their own routes. It was one of those stretches of highway where you could drive for hours without seeing much of anything. Just road, dry grass, and the occasional gas station that looked like it hadn't been updated in 30 years. Around 9 at night, I passed a small roadside motel with a diner attached to it. I thought about stopping, maybe grabbing a coffee, but I wasn't tired yet. I figured I'd keep going, maybe make it into Colorado before taking a break. I had plenty of fuel, my logbook was clean, and I was making good time. That was when I saw the first sign. It was one of those old-fashioned wooden signs, half-rotted, sitting just off the highway. The kind of thing you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. My headlights caught the faded lettering as I rolled past. I didn't think much of it at first. Plenty of old rest stops along these highways, some maintained, some not. I had used them before when I needed a quick stretch, though I preferred truck stops with other rigs around. Safer that way, but 2 miles wasn't far, and I was starting to feel that ache in my back from sitting too long. I figured I'd pull in, stretch my legs, maybe use the bathroom if it was clean enough. A few minutes later, I saw the turnoff. A narrow road, barely wide enough for a big rig, leading off the highway into the darkness. The sign was old, rusted, barely standing, but the words were still visible. I signaled, eased onto the exit, and followed the road. The pavement turned to gravel almost immediately. My tires crunched over the loose stone as I rolled forward, my headlights cutting through the darkness. There were no lights, no other vehicles, just trees on either side closing in tight. I slowed down. The place should have had at least some lighting. Even the worst rest stops usually had a few old street lamps, maybe a vending machine glowing in the dark. But this place was dead quiet. I kept going. Then I saw it. A small parking lot, cracked pavement, weeds pushing up through the cracks. An old brick building sat at the far end, the kind of structure that might have been nice 40 years ago but had been left to rot. A few picnic tables sat off to the side, their wood warped and splintered.
No lights.
No cars. I pulled into the lot, letting my rig roll to a stop. I kept the engine running. Something felt wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I knew it the second I stopped moving. The way the air felt too still, the way the trees seemed to press in closer than they should. I glanced around, checking my mirrors. Nothing, just empty space, darkness beyond the reach of my headlights. I was about to put the truck back in gear, forget about stretching, and get back on the highway. Then I noticed something. The bathroom door was open. Not wide open, just cracked. Just enough to see the dark space inside. It hadn't been open when I pulled in. I stared at it for a second, my hands tightening on the wheel. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe it had been open the whole time, and I just hadn't noticed. But I had a feeling deep in my gut that I wasn't alone. I put my truck in gear. That was when I saw the footprints. They were faint, barely visible in the gravel, but they were there, leading from the bathroom to where I had stopped. Not away, toward. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I hit the gas, my tires kicking up dust as I swung the rig around and aimed for the road. The gravel slid under my tires, the trailer rocking slightly as I forced the truck back onto the exit ramp. I checked my mirrors one last time. The bathroom door was closed. I never saw it move. I never stopped at a rest stop like that again.